Hey guys, I hope everybody got their exam turned in and didn't have any issues. Always email me at my Gmail address if you have any questions about anything like that. Like I said, I don't really know how to access any of the other emails. Today we're going to talk about Congress, and I'm sorry if this is a little bit longer of a lecture than normal, but this is where I've spent like my entire career, so I have a lot of things to say about it. It won't be super long. And it's just one lecture this week, so hang in with me. Next week we'll talk about the presidency, and our second quiz will be posted as well. All right, so let's dig in. Congress, my favorite topic. Your book starts with talking about the Constitution saying that the president can nominate with advice and consent of the Senate members of the Supreme Court. This is purposely vague. They wanted to put a legislative check on presidents while keeping primary control in their own hands. So in 2016, I was in DC during this time. It was a really exciting and crazy historic time. Justice Antonin Scalia passed away. And a majority leader at the time, Mitch McConnell, he's a Republican, he said the American people should have a say in who would replace Justice Scalia. Well, of course, President Obama was the president at the time, and he was a Democrat. He would have nominated a Democrat to fill this role, but the Senate majority leader said, we're not going to do that. We're going to wait and see what happens in the 2016 elections. He said the Senate was not going to hold hearings on it until after the election and really wanted to kind of block this. Obama nominated Merrick Garland, who, funnily enough, is currently our Attorney General. He was left, but not super left, but conservatives didn't give in. Most people agreed that the president serves a 4-year term and you can nominate in all 4 years. But Mitch McConnell couldn't go back on his word and risk alienating Republicans. So the standoff lasted throughout the fall. And then, of course, the rest is history. Donald Trump was elected as a Republican, nominated Neil Gorsuch over a year later, and he was confirmed. Says that he will vote with the conservative judges. Mitch McConnell surprisingly won that battle, but was it a battle that he should have been able to be in? Could he have had, honestly, more power than the president at that point? So we've talked about if Congress is who gets what and how, if politics is who gets what and how, Congress is at the center of that. It's at the center of American national politics. Congress decides who gets what, but it can also alter the rules or the how that determines who wins and loses in politics. Congress is generally distrusted, is viewed as incompetent, corrupt, partisan, at the beck and call of special interests. But as individuals, Americans like their representatives and senators and re-elect them often. There are 2 reasons for this love-hate relationship. Satisfied constituents and supportive party don't always make the institution more popular. Voters want their DC representatives to take care of their local and state interests and not to kind of go rogue and vote with the opposite party, but they also want them to take care of the nation's business and look mature and deliberative. There are rules that determine how Congress works. Secondly, rules that determine how Congress works were designed by our founders to produce a slow and careful lawmaking process. This is based on the promise of the compromise that often seems motionless to an impatient public. The safeguards of checks and balances is often forgotten at this point. So these 2 dynamics, legislators are really struggling to keep their jobs while meeting national expectations versus our own frustration with Congress's slowness. So we need to understand Congress a little bit here. Elected officials perform 2 major roles, representation and lawmaking. Representation, of course, are the efforts of elected officials to look out for the interests in those who elect them. National lawmaking is the creation of policy to address the problems and needs of the entire nation. These can conflict. What's good for us and our local community may not serve the national good. Members of Congress get reelected by pleasing voters in their district, so national problems may go unaddressed. Partisanship is loyalty to a party that helps shape how members see the world, define problems, and identify appropriate solutions. Members of Congress have to be responsive to their constituents and to the nation, but also to their party. But it's also an important part of how they identify themselves. And then, under representation, constituency. This is the voters in a state or district. You represent them whether they voted for you or not. There are 4 types of representation. Policy representation, which is congressional work done to advance the issues and ideological preferences of constituents. And then there's allocative representation, which is congressional work to secure projects and services and funds for the represented district. This used to be called pork barrel projects for bringing home the bacon, now referred to as earmarks, and it is something that Congress is considering again for the first time in many years. Pork barrel projects are public works and grants for specific districts paid for by general revenues. Earmarks are legislative provisions to allocate spending to a specific purpose or project. Why was that a tongue twister? For example, highway construction. It's electorally popular because they appear free to the district while costs are spread to all taxpayers. For a long time, they were banned. A long time when I worked on the Hill, we didn't even use the word earmark. It was kind of a hush-hush word. And honestly, we still are not using it. We're using it, but that's not what they're calling them anymore. They're calling them like district-based priorities and things like that. They're trying to find other ways of calling them things. But they tend to get thrown into must-pass pieces of legislation. So they're putting these earmarks now into funding the government. And so that's what they're looking at, which will hopefully be happening this week. Third is casework, legislative work on behalf of individual constituents to solve their problems with government agencies and programs. For example, sending a flag flown over the Capitol to a local high school, maybe help with your immigration problems. This is usually done in a local office, not in DC. So Joe Wilson represents us here in Lexington. He has an office in West Columbia. A lot of the folks that work out of that office are the ones who are going to be helping with casework. There's something called franking. This is the privilege of free mail service that's provided to members of Congress. Social media is being used more and more here, and this is not quite as effective as it used to be. And then fourth, symbolic representation, efforts of members of Congress to stand for American ideals or to identify with common constituency values. For example, a member of Congress will come speak at your graduation or attend a town meeting to explain what's happening in DC. They try to speak colloquially, dress like others around them. I am one of you, you can trust me. I worked for a member of Congress for a while who was a kind of a big deal businessman before he became a member of Congress. And I think that man probably only has ever worn suits his entire life. And he had a hard time, when he was going to be, for instance, visiting the state fair. And I'd be like, please don't wear a suit to the state fair to go judge this pig contest or whatever. People want you to look like one of them and not like your fancy self. You want to look like one of the people around you. You want to look like you can be trusted. Symbolic representation. National lawmaking. Congress needs to create laws that serve the common good. This is called a collective responsibility. Congress should be responsible for the effectiveness of its laws in solving national problems. This is a variety of factors guided by conscience, ideology, demands of constituents, interest groups, party position. It can be at odds with representation, making it hard to fulfill a collective responsibility. We want Congress to focus on the nation's problems, but as voters, we tend to reward members for putting constituent concerns first. Here's a word you're going to hear a lot: hyperpartisanship. This is a commitment to party so strong that it can transcend other commitments. This is huge in DC right now. We're very polarized. Polarized, of course, polarization, the ideological difference between the parties and the ideological homogeneity within them. Hyperpartisanship can be made worse by increased polarization between the parties. We're very polarized in DC right now. We're very hyperpartisan. The last time hyperpartisanship was at play this extensively was in probably the 1900s. It's a really fierce divider of the American public. Because of this, compromise goes out the window. It has led to government shutdowns. October 2013, January, 2020. When there's a refusal to pass a continuing budget resolution, which is sort of where we are right now, it allows the government to continue operating, but they will attach other things to this pieces of legislation. So like every year they have to pass the budget, but they attach other things to it. In 2013, they were fighting over Obamacare. They were saying, we're not going to pass Obamacare unless you pass this budget. It was a 16-day long shutdown in 2016. In 2019, it was 35 days long. And when my husband and I were both employed by the government, we started applying for jobs in South Carolina then. And that was over mostly President Trump saying he wanted to build a wall. So there are a lot of different congressional powers and responsibilities. Our founders gave Congress a lot of power, but it couldn't have imagined the scope of contemporary congressional power since they never really anticipated the growth of the federal government to today's size. They were more concerned with the representation of short-term popular opinion and less with the conflict between local and national interests. So there's some differences between the House and the Senate. Congress, both in the House and the Senate, each Congress is numbered. Right now, I think we're in the 117th Congress. Each has a 2-year cycle. We have a bicameral legislature. This is a legislature with 2 chambers. Laid out in the Constitution, we wanted 2 chambers to serve as a restraint on each other, strengthening checks and balances. The smaller, more elite Senate would cool the passions of the people represented in the House. They're equal in their overall power. Both can initiate legislation, but tax bills have to come from the House. They have to start in the House. Both must pass every bill in identical form before it can be signed by the president to become law, but there are a few extra responsibilities assigned to the Senate. The biggest difference: the Senate, of course, only has 100 members, so there's less formal rules needed. You have a 6-year term in the Senate, and they're staggered, so not all elections are at the same time. They can suspend their campaigning for about 4 to 5 years and focus on the nation. In the Senate, you have to be 30 years old to be elected, older, wiser, better able to deal with national lawmaking. They were originally elected by state legislatures, but in 1913, this was changed to be elected directly by the people. The House has 435 members, so they need a lot more formal rules and hierarchy to function effectively. They have 2-year terms, but basically they never stop campaigning. You must be 25 years old. Budget bills originate in the House, but the Senate has to pass them as well. The House has the power to impeach, but the Senate does the impeachment trial. Both Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton, and now Donald Trump were impeached by the House, but the Senate has failed to find the president guilty of the charges brought by the House. The founders have been concerned with executive tyranny, so they granted Congress the bulk of the lawmaking power. So Congress has the responsibility to pass laws, but they don't become a law unless the president signs them or refrains from vetoing them, or both houses of Congress are able to muster a full 2/3 majority to override a presidential veto. The president can't vote or even introduce legislation, but he has a State of the Union address every year, which I think is March 1st this year, that allows him a time to recommend such measures as he shall judge necessary and expedient. Congressional oversight is a committee's investigation of the executive and government agencies to ensure they're acting as Congress intends. This is usually done through hearings and selective investigations of executive actions. It's essential for Congress to be certain that it will be carried out. When parties are controlled by opposite powers, oversight can really become a political weapon. Another check on the executive is the requirement that presidential appointments must be made with advice and consent of the Senate. This is the constitutional obligation that the Senate approves certain executive appointments. Most of the time they proceed without incident, but like I talked about earlier, sometimes the Senate can use their power to do more than advise and consent and tie up appointments for political reasons. The differences in constituencies of the House and the Senate, or the President and Congress, they all kind of look at policy in terms of a national constituency and their own policy program. For example, maybe the president says we need a clean air bill, but a member of Congress says, well, that means closing a factory in my district and jobs being lost, so I can't do that. It's tough that they're at odds. So congressional elections, the House is elected every 2 years, the Senate every 6 years. It takes a lot of time. Most aspects of Congress are probably designed to aid the re-election goals of its members. The way a district is drawn can also really determine success. The Constitution says each state will have 2 senators, which is easy. The House will be allocated on the basis of population of a state, which fluctuates over time. This is based on something called reapportionment, a reallocation of Congress among the states every 10 years following the census. We just had a census last year, and so they're looking at reapportionment now. The 435 seats are reallocated every 10 years after a census, and the states who have populations who grow gain seats. Those who have populations who shrink lose seats. South Carolina gained a seat in the last census, in the 2016 or 2010 census, and now have 7 members of the House. How do we count people? A lot of people don't fill out the household questionnaires that the census sends out. Maybe poor people and immigrants, they're maybe not usually counted because they're afraid to fill it out. Democrats want them to because they usually vote Democrat. Republicans don't because they fear that it will add to Democratic representation. Something called redistricting is the process of dividing states into legislative districts. It keeps the districts relatively equal in population, one person, one vote. An average district size is about a little over 700,000. It can turn into a really bitter political battle, though, because it's carried out by state legislatures. How the lines are drawn has a lot to do with who gets elected. Gerrymandering, of course, this is redistricting to benefit a particular group. It can result, in some really strange shapes by the time state politicians are through. There are 3 types of gerrymandering. Partisan gerrymandering, which is redistricting controlled by the majority party in the state's legislature to increase the number of districts that the party can expect to carry. For example, like a Democratic legislature may draw a district that would split a historically Republican district and force an incumbent Republican to run in a new, more liberal district. This is called cracking. Or to draw a district to concentrate as many opposition party voters as possible, called packing, so the party drawing the districts can more easily win in the surrounding districts. The second type of gerrymandering is called pro-incumbent gerrymandering. When state legislators agree to create districts to enhance the electoral security of the current members of both parties. When state legislators are so closely divided that neither party can dictate the redistricting process. And then the third is called racial gerrymandering. This is redistricting to enhance or reduce the chances that a racial or ethnic group will elect members to the legislature, drawing to favor or disadvantage a racial or ethnic group. Is geography a better basis for congressional representation than race, religion, gender, occupation, or economic group? We're just drawn based on where we live. That might not be the best way. Okay, you've decided to run for Congress. How are you going to go about it? There are no educational requirements. You don't even need to have graduated from college or high school. It's a lighter job qualification than most jobs that you guys are going to be applying for. But you have to prepare yourself to be exposed to the critical scrutiny of your prospective constituents and opponent. Why would anyone want to do that? There's a low esteem in which Congress is held by most Americans, and it's really expensive to run. Some are motivated by the desire to serve the public. Maybe you're motivated by ideology, a commitment to enact policy that represents your strongly held values. Members of Congress make $174,000 a year, which puts you as a top wage earner, but you really need to consider the fact that you have to maintain 2 residences. You are having to live in your district back home and also in DC, and it's really, really expensive to live in DC. So that salary doesn't cover it for a lot, and a lot of members of Congress sleep in their offices. They don't even have a second house in DC. You have to be independently wealthy, honestly, to have one. Some of the perks of being a member of Congress include a travel allowance, which is not as generous maybe as our textbook describes it. The travel allowance basically is there to allow you to travel back to your district, back and forth from DC to your district back home. The text also says you get ample staff, which that's also a generous way of describing it. There were not very many of us working for members of Congress, and we were very overworked. Franking privileges, which we talked about earlier, which is free like mail, but you can't just like mail your Valentine that way. You have to, has to be congressionally related. Free parking, the book says free parking at the Reagan Airport, which is funny because you actually kind of get free parking around town. That is a nice perk. Health and life insurance and a pension. It's interesting, that's such a debated topic, that their health and life insurance and pension are the same as mine as a staffer from DC. You only, vest if you work there for a certain amount of time. Everybody thinks it's such a big deal that they get this, but it's honestly the same as any member of staff on Capitol Hill. You have basically no job security. It's non-existent for anyone, for a member of Congress or for their staff. No matter how hard you work, you're sure to face an opponent who claims you're not doing enough and that it's time for a change. So you have to work harder, raise more money, be more popular just to keep your job. It's really tough on families who either divide time or live without one parent for part of the year. A lot of people become disenchanted with the job, and the level of conflict is so high and the bitter partisan infighting is so rough that it makes it not much fun. What does it take to win, though? Usually you need political and financial assets. You need experience. Political amateurs without previous experience rarely win unless they're already famous or extremely wealthy, maybe like Donald Trump. Strategic politicians or office seekers who base the decision to run on a rational calculation that they'll be successful. Is this a district or state that I can win? For example, am I a Republican in a Democratic district? Who is my opponent going to be? The electoral edge is afforded to those who are already in office. Incumbents are hard to beat. The evil you know. Can I get the funds necessary to run a winning campaign? Non-incumbents spend as much as 4 times to win. Incumbents have a lot more access to funds. What kind of year is this? Some years are good for Republicans, some are good for Democrats. Presidential popularity is important, state of the economy, military engagements. If it's a presidential election year, the enthusiasm for a popular presidential candidate might sweep fellow members to victory in its coattail effect. This is less significant lately. Coattail effect is the added votes received by congressional candidates of a winning presidential party. Then there's something called midterm loss, which I have a feeling we're going to experience later this fall. It is the tendency for a presidential party to lose congressional seats in off-year elections. So because 2020 was a year, the year where Joe Biden was elected, 2022 is likely to be a year where the opposing party, in this case Republicans, will probably win. It has happened year after year after year. It's almost always, you can almost always count on a midterm loss pattern. Excuse me. So if you're elected, now let's talk about what happens if you're being a representative. Descriptive representation is the idea of an elected body that they should mirror demographically the population it represents. John Adams, one of our founders, said that a representative assembly should be in miniature an exact portrait of the people in large. It should think, feel, reason, and act like them. I think Congress fails at that pretty miserably. Congress is dominated by lawyers and business people, politicians. Adults at large over our country, about 27% are college grads and about 9% have advanced degrees. In Congress, over 3/4 of them have advanced degrees and their income is well above average. A lot of millionaires, because this is who can afford to move to DC and maintain 2 homes and 2 lives and campaigns and things like that. Women and minorities are not typically well represented in Congress, but it's more representative today than it has been. Until the 60s, civil rights, hardly any blacks or Hispanics were in the House. Women did better because of the common practice of appointing and sometimes electing a congressman's widow to office when the member died. And in the 1970s, women started getting elected on their own in significant numbers. By the 1990s, more groups were being represented better. Does it matter if Congress looks like the people it represents? Having one of our own often takes the form of being more informed, having a higher sense of efficacy, efficiency, sometimes having a higher turnout, but we're unsure if it actually produces better policies. The official business of Congress is making laws, and the rules that determine where the power is and who can exercise it is Congress. So Congress is organized along party lines. In each chamber, the party with the most members is the majority party. They decide the rules for the chamber, and they get the top leadership posts, such as the Speaker of the House, the Majority Leader in the Senate, chairs of all the committees and subcommittees. The majority party is the party with the most seats in House of Congress. Right now, the Democrats are the majority party in both the House and the Senate. Party is also important because it's the mechanism for members' advancements. All positions are determined by the party, and members have to advance within their own party for positions of power in the House or Senate, whether as a committee chair or party leadership. Parties stand for different things. Democrats, more liberal values. Republicans, more conservative ones. When they win, they vote for different things. Party polarization. There are greater ideological, like liberal versus conservative differences between the parties and increased ideological consensus within the parties. Today, like I said earlier, is very hyperpartisan. Almost all Democrats are very liberal and almost all Republicans are very conservative. There are a few in the middle anymore, which is really tough because it's hard to find. When you're writing a piece of legislation in DC, you want to have a member of both sides of the aisle on your legislation. It's really hard now when folks are so polarized. It's hard to find a co-sponsor of a bill. So the leadership, majority and minority parties elect their own leaders who are leaders of Congress. They have strong centralized leadership that allows Congress to be more efficient in enacting party or presidential programs, but it gives less independence to members to take care of their own constituencies or pursue their own policy preferences. The Constitution provides for the election of some specific congressional officers, but Congress itself determines how much power each chamber will have. The main leadership offices are the Speaker of the House, the majority leader, the minority leader, and the whips. The Speaker of the House is the leader of the majority party in the House who serves as the presiding officer of the House of Representatives. Right now, it's Nancy Pelosi, elected by the majority party, and it's the most powerful House member. The House Majority Leader is the second in command, which is given a wide-ranging responsibilities to assist the Speaker. The Senate is similar, but the presiding officer is the Vice President, who can cast the tie-breaking vote when necessary, but otherwise doesn't vote. Right now, we have a 50-50 split, so that vice presidential vote is very important. When the Vice President isn't present, which is usually, the presiding officer is the President pro tem, which is the honor given to the longest serving senator of the majority party, usually performed by a junior member. The presiding officer in the House is less powerful, where debate is tightly controlled. The focus in the Senate is the majority leader and minority leader. Each is advised by party committees on both policy and personnel matters. And then both parties have chambers with what's called a whip, which comes from an old English hunting expression, the whipper in, which is charged with keeping the dogs together in pursuit of the fox. They're elected by the members, and they find out how people intend to vote so they can adjust the legislation, negotiate acceptable amendments, or employ favors or threats to secure votes. Very often, we would get a call from the whip's office and say, how is your boss planning to vote on this legislation? And what can we do to change your mind if you're not on the same page as us? Whipping them into shape. So leaders can exercise only the power their party members give them. Strong leaders can move legislation along, get the party program passed, do favors for members, improve party standing, but they also can pursue a national party or presidential goals at the expense of members' pet projects and constituency interest, and they can withhold favors. Seniority system is the accumulation, sorry, my talk is loud, the accumulation of power and authority in conjunction with the length of time spent in office. Newt Gingrich became the most powerful speaker in 1994 in the modern era. They gave him powers because his leadership enabled him to take control of the House and enact a well-publicized conservative agenda. Nancy Pelosi was elected the first female speaker in 2006, and she is the speaker again today. Her role in passing Obamacare was crucial, and she was effective at maintaining the support and discipline of her Democratic majority. She has held on to her leadership even in the minority and regained her speakership when the Democrats took power again. Meeting as full bodies, it would be hard for the House and Senate to consider and deliberate on all 10,000 bills and 100,000 nominations they receive every 2 years. So it's broken up and sent to what's called a committee. Constitution says nothing about committees, so they're completely creatures of the chambers of Congress they serve. The longer service on a committee permitted members to develop an expertise and specialization in a particular policy area, and thus bills would be considered more efficiently. The nitty-gritty details of legislation are really worked out in committee. The committees hold hearings, staff reports, investigations. They act as the eyes and ears and workhorses of Congress in considering drafting and redrafting proposed legislation. There are 4 types of committee. A standing committee, which is a permanent committee responsible for legislation in a particular policy area. I have worked for the Small Business Committee, the Judiciary Committee, and the Oversight Committee. They carry on from one Congress to the next, and they review most pieces of legislation introduced to Congress. The House Rules Committee is the committee that determines how and when debate on a bill will take place. Senate doesn't have a comparable committee, but in the House, they have the Rules Committee. The rules provide a rule for each bill that specifies when it will be debated, how long debate will last, how it can be amended. But the House is so large, so debate would be endless if the rules didn't provide this structure. And then there's something called a Select Committee. This is a committee appointed to deal with an issue of a problem not suited to a standing committee. For example, like 2014, the House Select Committee on Benghazi investigated what happened in the consulate attack on Benghazi. Then there's something called a joint committee. The combined House and Senate committees formed to coordinate activities to expedite legislation in a certain area. In the 114th Congress, it was printing, economics, taxation, and the library, probably the same in the next few. And then in order to make a bill law, both houses have to pass the exact same bill in the exact same form, but the process is different with both houses. So they could end up looking different by the end. So they have what's called a conference committee. These are temporary committees formed to reconcile differences in the House and Senate versions of a bill. They're appointed by a presiding officer of each chamber, who usually taps a senior member, especially the chair of the committee that considered the bills, and these conferees are usually members of those committees. So how do you get on the right committee? Because so much is done on the committee level, it's important for re-election to be on the right one for them to best serve their constituency. Deciding who gets on what committee varies by party and what chamber, but you usually are rewarded by supporting policy positions and accommodating members best they can, since it's the goal to support ranks and help find success. Seniority is very important, but the chairs of the committee do serve at the pleasure of their party caucuses and leadership. Congressional staff. A vast majority of congressional staff work for individuals is done by staff members in congressional offices and in committees. House of Representatives have about 17 staff members, a lot of them back home in the district, and the Senate has about 40 per office. Each either legislative work or constituency services are done. You also have interns who supplement the full-time staff, and then committee staff, of course, doing a lot of the committee work. Congress is reluctant to be dependent on the executive branch for information. So it's built its own research organizations and agencies to facilitate its work. It has the Congressional Research Service, which does a lot of research for members of Congress, the Government Accountability Office, which kind of audits the books, and then the Congressional Budget Office, Congress's economic advisor. A lot of times, you heard probably earlier this year, they wouldn't vote until they heard the CBO score on something. This is the Congressional Budget Office that can estimate about the budget deficit, surplus, national debt, forecast how they will be influenced by tax and spending policies. So policies are results of both external and internal forces. Of course, an external force is like a problem important to citizens at any given time, policy preferences of the president, and so on. 3 characteristics of policymaking are important. You can have separate houses and identical bills. The Constitution requires that almost all congressional policy has to be passed in identical form by both houses, which is challenging because they serve different constituencies and they operate differently. As a bill becomes law, it's broken into bits and then each considered individually by committees. It makes it hard to coordinate what a bill does with laws that are already on the books or what other committees are doing in similar areas. It also makes it hard for the president to take a large-scale coordinated approach to our major policy problems. Then norms of conduct. Norms are informal rules that govern behavior in Congress, sometimes called folkways that are usually learned by newcomers. For example, work hard, develop a specialization, treat other members with the utmost courtesy, reciprocate favors, take pride in your chamber. This aids in getting things done. How a bill becomes law some of the time. We all probably remember that Schoolhouse Rock, how a bill becomes law, but it's not exactly the way we have always thought it was. There are very few ideas that actually make it into law, and those that do have a really difficult path to follow. So before a law is passed, it has to be something Congress thinks it should do and be on the legislative agenda. And the legislative agenda is a slate of proposals and issues that representatives think it worthwhile to consider and act on. Because the public attention is so intently focused on the presidential election and campaign, a new president is really effective at setting a congressional agenda. Later in their terms, they use maybe the State of the Union to outline the agenda they'd like Congress to pursue. It doesn't guarantee success, but it can get attention from Congress. Sometimes this can be triggered by a well-publicized event. For example, in 2010, the explosion of the BP Deepwater Horizon drilling platform drew attention to energy policy and the need to do something to protect the environment. Sometimes a member just finds something in his or her own interest, politically or ideologically, to invest time and political resources in pushing this policy. This is called policy entrepreneurship. This is the practice of legislators becoming experts and taking leadership roles in specific policy areas. Those with ambition and vision and luck choose the issues that matter in our lives. So a bill has to be introduced by a member of Congress, even if it was the president's idea, formally introduced by putting the bill in what's called a hopper in the House, where it goes to the clerk of the House, or by giving it to the presiding officer of the Senate. It's then given a number. In the House, it starts with HR, for example, like HR 932, or in the Senate, it starts with an S, like S 932. A bill introduced in the House first goes through the House, and then to the Senate, and then vice versa, and then they can be considered simultaneously. A bill has to be referred to committee, which is largely automatic, but sometimes can fall under the jurisdiction of more than one committee, so the speaker exercises power about where it goes. Then it moves to subcommittee, where it may or may not get consideration. A lot of bills die here because committee members don't care about the issue. Even if a member doesn't seriously believe the bill will pass, sometimes the member just wants to be seen back home as taking action on an issue. So bills that subcommittees will take up will have hearings, testimony from experts, interest groups, executive department secretaries, etc. They'll make changes and revisions, and if a committee votes in favor of the final version of a bill, it goes forward to the floor. So getting to the floor. In the House, bills goes from a standing committee to the Rules Committee, which I talked about earlier. Each rule will give, the Rules Committee will give each bill a rule, which includes when and how a bill will be considered. An open rule means any amendments at all can be proposed and added as long as they're germane or relevant. A lot of appropriations bills are these ways, and it's a hard time because it means really long nights. You can add endless amounts of amendments. But it would take forever to get things done if that's how it always worked. So it's more typically leadership gains more control by limiting the time for debate and restricting amendments that can be offered on what's called a closed rule bill. In the Senate guarantees that all bills have an open rule by default. Thus, senators have access to the floor for whatever they want in a way that's denied to the House. They have this tradition of unlimited debate, which means any member can talk indefinitely, which leads us to a filibuster, the practice of unlimited debate in order to prevent or delay a vote on a bill. Senators opposed to a bill can filibuster it in order to tie up the bill, tie up the floor in nonstop debate to prevent the Senate from voting. Can only usually be stopped by cloture, which is a vote to end the filibuster, which requires a 3/4 majority or 60 votes. Often senators will read the telephone book, or Ted Cruz read Green Eggs and Ham. You just have to keep talking. The nuclear option is a controversial Senate maneuver by which a simple majority can decide to allow a majority to bypass the filibuster rules for certain kinds of votes. We're talking about changing the filibuster rules again right now. It's just something that happens every so often. Some unorthodox lawmaking. Sometimes the congressional leaders will deal with a logjam of bills by packaging them together in what's called an omnibus. This is a large bill that contains so many important elements that members can't afford to defeat it. The president can't afford to veto it, even if the bill contains elements they dislike. This has become the norm for passing most of the budget and many other hard-to-pass bills. A bill can be killed or left to die in committee or subcommittee, in the Rules Committee, any committee in the Senate, and then it also has to be passed on both floors in both houses. There are multiple ways to vote in the House. A simple voice vote. All in favor say aye, all opposed say nay. Or a roll call vote where they actually go through each individual's name and you say, do you vote yes or no? It's a roll call vote is publicly recorded and a matter of public record. So people will know how you voted on something. Any bill that's alive, once it gets past all of this, goes to the president's desk. He can sign it and it becomes law, or he can veto it and send it back to the originating House of Congress. A veto can be overridden by 2/3 vote in both houses of Congress. A president can also kill a bill with what's called a pocket override, which is his authority to kill a bill submitted within 10 days at the end of a legislative session by not signing it at all. Does it make a difference that Americans really dislike Congress so much? We talked about things like term limits and limiting Congress to somewhere between 8 and 10 years. That maybe would work if there was evidence that serving in Congress corrupted people, but there's no such evidence, so it's making it tough to be about being a cleaner institution. We've had some campaign finance laws that have been important and made an impact. Institutional reform, speed up lawmaking. This is probably not going to fundamentally change how the public feels about Congress. Congress has the power to act, and when it's unified and motivated, it usually does. It just has a harder time getting things done in a really divided society that we live in now. Our founders intended to create this legislature that wouldn't move hastily or without deliberation, but sometimes it works so well that Congress is seen as not even moving at all. Democracy's messy, guys. Congress has these conflicting goals of representing constituents and working together to solve national problems and operating as members of opposing party teams, which sometimes unnecessarily conflict. it's really fascinating up close, but sometimes to the outside observer, it's not. It's not. It's really ugly and it's not fun to watch. All right, guys, thanks for hanging in with me with this long lecture, and we'll be back next week talking about the presidency.